Hello and welcome back to Season 6 of Rehydrate. This season we'll be reading and discussing Isaac Asimov's The Original Foundation trilogy, including Foundation, Foundation and Empire, and Second Foundation. This is Season 6, Episode 1, The Psychohistorians and the Encyclopedists, covering Parts 1 and 2 of the first book of the trilogy, Foundation. The hosts have varying levels of knowledge on this book in this series. My name is Dan. I have listened to the first book, Foundation, but I have not read anything else past that. As a little background on myself, I'm not a very prolific reader, but as of evidenced by our podcast earlier seasons, I've been really into the Remembrance of Earth's Past series by Lisa Shin and read other series like Game of Thrones and other things, but I don't normally read that much.
My name is Talia. I have been interested in science fiction in short story form and then longer form for a while. And so obviously Asimov was so intriguing. I knew I was going to read him. He was next on my list. And only 11 years later, I finally am for the first time. So I've never read anything by Isaac Asimov, but I know he's sometimes dubbed like the granddaddy of science fiction. And I know he has a lot of influence on other authors like Ursula K. Le Guin and Liu Cixin, who Dan just mentioned. So I'm excited to see if he lives up to what I've heard about him. And in preparation for this podcast, I read the reading that you can find on the website, but I have not finished the series or even finished the book before this recording.
My name is Priya, and I am a pretty avid sci-fi reader. Back in college, I took a whole sci-fi class, so I got exposed to a lot of different sci-fi readers through that. And recently, I've been reading more sci-fi, and I was really excited to read this book by Asimov because I did read one other work by him, I, Robot, which everyone knows, and I really love that. So I'm excited to sort of delve into this. And I've only read the first two parts of this book so far, which we're covering this podcast. So I have no other knowledge of the books.
Cool. Just talk a little bit more about the structure of this podcast. So we are just like the Remembrance of Earth's Past series. We're only going to spoil up to the current reading and then anything previous to that, but we won't be spoiling anything past that. Mostly because we don't know. We haven't read it ourselves. I know a little bit about the first book, but I don't know anything about the rest of them. So the intention is for you to go, for all the listeners to look at the reading list that's on our website and kind of read along with us as for how we split it up per episode. Again, we're only be covering the first 3 books in this season. And by the first 3 books, I mean the first 3 books that were written in chronological order, like in the order they were released.
Yeah, if people don't know about Asimov and the Foundation series, it was actually quite prolific, and he began writing in the 1940s and wrote like for the next lifetime. So there's a couple different orders to read it in, but for the structure of this show, we're going to read it in the order that they came from the author. So in the order they were written.
Right. Yeah, because the timeline gets a little messy with like prequels, and then even the iRobot series apparently gets stuck into the canonical timeline. So it's really just the first 3 books. So Foundation, which was written in 1951, Foundation and Empire was 1952, and then Second Foundation in 1953. So I mean, those of them were released, or that's the dates I found. I know like Foundation itself was kind of put into magazines and kind of done piecemeal, but that's the date that was there.
Yeah, and I think a lot of science fiction owes its current structure to these early authors like Asimov, because a lot of the science fiction I mentioned I listened to or read was in short form, is because they wouldn't really have the audience, or they didn't predict they'd have the audience for a full-length book. So a lot of science fiction was released either episodically or in hyper short novella forms in magazines, and then sometimes those later became the full books that we have now.
And another note around the series, I know there's a TV show that's going to be on Apple TV Plus that's coming out soon in September-ish. I don't know what part of the books or series is going to be covering, or if it's going to be like doing one book per season or anything. So I am not planning on watching it or covering it as part of this podcast, at least for this season, maybe in future seasons once we finish the entire series. But I'm really spoiler averse, so I don't want to watch it and get spoiled on something that I haven't read yet. So this podcast won't be covering the TV show itself. I'm going to jump into doing the summary for this episode. So every episode, I will collect what happened and kind of go over it as a jumping off point for our discussion. So we start out with Gul Dornick making his first trip ever to Trantor, a planet at the center of the Empire that has been turned into an enormous city with no self-sustaining agriculture. He's there to meet with Harry Seldon to work on a mysterious project. The project is made even more mysterious when Seldon's reputation as a raven that portends doom is revealed ahead of his meeting with the man himself. Seldon appears in Dornick's hotel room and confirms that he does foresee doom, but not on intuition, but based on a complex mathematical formula that is developed that could predict events into the far future that he calls psychohistory. These predictions do not sit well with the Empire, as they put both Seldon and Dornick on trial and are questioned about Seldon's predictions and intentions. Seldon says psychohistory predicts not only the destruction of Trantor, but the fall of the Empire itself. Seldon proposes that the chaotic era following the fall of the Empire can be reduced from 30,000 years to just 1,000 years if they allow him to form a group that will compile the sum of knowledge into a single volume, or maybe multiple volumes. The Advocate is skeptical, but ultimately agrees to let Seldon form his group, exiled to a remote planet named Terminus. This appears to be a setback, but according to Seldon, it was all within his predictions. 50 years later, on Terminus, work has continued on Encyclopedia Galactica, with the Board of Trustees holding the real power on the planet. Meanwhile, its first mayor, Salvor Hardin, pleads with the council to take action regarding the recent takeover of the sector by Anacreon, leaving the planet without access to any resources. The board is hesitant to get involved with politics and instead wants to focus on its work. They receive the sub-prefect of Anacreon to gauge their intentions. Anacreon intends to tax Terminus despite its lack of ability to pay taxes and their status as directly appointed by the emperor. Since there are no resources, the sub-prefect instead agrees that they give up land on the planet instead. The conversation is stalled when it's insinuated that the planet possesses nuclear weapons, while the knowledge of nuclear power has been long forgotten by most others in the galaxies, including the Empire. Lord Dorwin, a representative of the Empire, arrives to make an arrangement with Anacreon, but after it's ratified, it's found that it's essentially toothless and cedes all power to Anacreon. The board is still hesitant to take on any political action, and Mayor Hardin plans a coup to seize power of the planet. The board instead waits for the anticipated message from Seldon himself that is to come on the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Foundation. Seldon's message does appear and informs them that the entire mission of the Encyclopedia has been a fraud. He says that the Foundation will face a series of crises to which there is only one inevitable path, ultimately leading to the fall of the stagnating empire and founding of the Second Empire by the Foundation. Hardin is given control of Terminus and asks what the next move is, to which he replies, "It's obvious as hell." So normally I read the characters, but does someone else want to do it? I talk a lot in these things, so
I don't know how any of them are pronounced, but I'll take it.
It's interesting that I think these characters are harder to pronounce than any of the Liu Cixin ones, because even though they're all in Chinese, I think these are harder because they have no basis in English, or have some basis in English, but not my remedial Chinese was able to get me through a lot of the Remembrance of the past, but these are
You
more
seem to
difficult.
have very little basis in reality. I think that's the problem.
Perfect. So no one can correct me. So a lot of characters are introduced, so we'd like to level set by repeating them here with short descriptions. Harry Seldon, the founder of psychohistory. Gail Dornick, a mathematics PhD who takes a job working for the Seldon Project. Gerald, who meets Gail on the observation deck, actually an agent of the Commission on Public Safety. Loris Avakin, Gail's lawyer. Linj Chen, Chief Commissioner of Public Safety and Judge of Seldon's trial. Louis Perrien, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Foundation of the Encyclopedia Galactica on Terminus. Salvor Hardin, the first mayor of Terminus City. Anselm Hotpodic, the sub-prefect of Pluma and envoy extraordinary of His Highness of Anacreon. Lord Dorwin, a nobleman of the Galactic Empire who arrives on Terminus as a representative of the Emperor. So
the first thing I want to just talk about, just to kind of a meta discussion around the book, is how everyone's reading it. So my experience with quote unquote reading this book is I took a long road trip over the summer, and I was like, well, people talk about Foundation, so I got the audiobook, which was really a really old, it was like a recording of an old cassette or something. It sounded like from the 60s or 70s or something like that, but quality was really bad, and the narrator was very monotone. He tried to do some voices every so often, but anyway, I I thought the concepts were interesting, but I was like kind of tuning in and out of it. But it's like the overall concepts of the book were interesting enough to want to continue on it. But then when I started this project, I read it instead on an ebook, which is normally how I do it. I found it to be way better. Like the experience of reading this book versus listening to this book, because one, I'm focusing on it, just paying more attention rather than just zoning out when I'm driving on, in the middle of nowhere. It's just, I just found it way better. So I'm just interested what your guys' experience and actually how you're actually reading these books.
So I am reading it on ebook right now, and I'm glad I didn't even bother trying to get an audiobook based on your experience, Dan, because that really, really kills the book for me when the narrator is like boring or monotonous. But I've been telling you that I recently listened to Andy Weir's new book, Project Hail Mary, on audiobook, and that is like absolutely amazing. And I can't imagine reading it, without the audio sound effect. It's almost like a performance. So if it's like that would work. But I can imagine this book getting extremely difficult if it's on with a bad narrator. So
I know there is a radio dramatization of this book. I haven't listened to it, but I know it exists. But I wonder if it's bad. I specifically didn't choose it because I wanted to get like I didn't want to like, I want to get the text. Like I wanted to like have the experience of reading it without reading it, but I know it exists.
Except when you get to Dorwin's parts, it becomes very difficult. I mean, in those parts, I wish I had somebody reading it to me.
Yeah, I was thinking like, well, maybe I should have gone back and listened to like that part from the audio. We'll get to that, but
did that narrator do a voice for Dorwin at least?
I can't remember, but I think you might have.
The only sound to break the short silence that followed was the clicking of the lid of Lord Dorwin's snuff-box, and then he put it away and said, "A great achievement, this encyclopedia of yours, Haddon. A feat indeed to rank with the most majestic accomplishments of all time."
That's where I can come in as someone who has listened or listened to part of the BBC radio. I assume that's the same interpretation. I don't know if there's been more than one radio play, but
yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
yeah, exactly. So yes, they do all the voices. But in terms of how I'm consuming this media, if you listen to the last season of Rehydrate, I was a co-host for the spoiler cast for the Remembrance of Earth's Past series. And since recording that, or since beginning that and beginning this season, I have moved to New York City. And as a result of that, I have a lot more time sitting on the subway. And I have chosen to spend some of that time reading a paperback copy that I have, or rather, that I took from my father, who was a bit of a science fiction nut back in the day and thus has this vintage copy, which is really good for me. It's paperback, so it's really small compared to the three body books, which are all like very bulky. This one fits really easily, and I'm able to steal away even just a couple minutes. I think it's pretty digestible, and I think it's very dynamic and fun to read. Although I do alternate with the BBC radio play, I think it's enjoyable, and it definitely helps my comprehension to hear it twice. But I'll have to check when it was recorded because it feels like the audio mixing is just bananas. In between the scene changes, they play like, and I grew up partially in the UK watching like the old school Doctor Who, and it reminds me of those sound effects. Like in between scenes, there's like a wee oo, and it sort of like makes me laugh when I should be focusing, and it's mixed a little too loud, so you can't really focus on the characters because it's deafening to your eardrums. But it's sweet, and I still recommend it.
So is it like a straight like retelling of the story, or do they actually like move like story parts around?
No, it's not a straight retelling. There's artistic
Okay.
license. So it may
Yeah.
have spoilers, Dan. So maybe you should
I
be
know.
alert.
That's what I was worried about.
Exactly. I know.
We've already mentioned this series a bunch of times, but we just got finished with reading the Remembrance of Earth Past series, or podcasting about it, and that's how the three of us met, was talking about that. So get ready for a lot of references to that on this podcast. We'll try not to give any spoilers if you haven't read it yet, but there will be a lot of references to it, I'd imagine. So one of the first things I want to bring up is kind of the contrast in style between that series and this series. So when I read it, I immediately noticed the contrast in style. So Lewis Shin is, famously a very hardcore science fiction writer, and his books are very dense at points And you have to go through a lot of technical explanation. I think this book is a lot more world building, and it just felt like an easier read to me. Like it just like it kind of flowed easier to read. Was that your guys' experience too?
Yeah, definitely. So I think there I tend to see the Liu Cixin's writing as like it's very different in some parts than it is in others. Like there are some parts where he also focuses a lot on the human element and the character driven elements that make good sci-fi. And I think without that, the trilogy would not be what it is. But I think Asimov is more digestible to someone who isn't very much into like hard science, but wants to explore like the overarching themes of like sci-fi and science, like the cool parts of science, like it definitely feels like it's more of like an exploration of humanity and like a humanity driven exploration of a distant future. To me, that's what it reads as. And it's a little more quirky, and to me it seems, of course because of the time period in which it was written, a little borderline campy, but I don't hate that. So
yeah, and it seems to focus a lot on the politics of the far future, right, too, which I thought was really, really interesting. I always love those. That's the most interesting part of the Song of Ice and Fire series is all the politics of Westeros, right? So this is like the politics of the Galactic Empire or whatever they call it. So I think that stuff is also super interesting, like the interplay between Terminus and Anacreon and the Empire, and like how they weren't able to ratify any kind of meaningful treaty. All those interplays I think are super interesting to me.
It's also interesting how it seems almost like a very archaic system in some ways, because you have like empires and emperors, and like it doesn't seem like what you would expect from a futuristic world. So that just the way that it reads is interesting, and the politics seems antiquated, but you're like thousands of years into the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that was a deliberate decision, right? Because like they're trying to show the kind of fall and the stagnation of that empire being predicted.
Right,
Similar to like
I thought the same
evolution.
thing.
Yeah,
similar to like Rome or something, right? In like the late stages of Rome, how they had an emperor and that was stagnating and falling, and eventually did. So I think that's probably parallels there. And then the foundation is probably more science. They probably want to found the new second empire based on science, right? And that kind of thing. So I think that's probably intentional. How about how do you think? What did you think of the difference in styles?
I really liked Priya's assessment because it seems so grand. I noticed things, I think, on a smaller scale as we were going through the summary. For me, I think it was maybe 50 pages into the book where I got my first aha moment. It was like the first turn was being exiled to Terminus, and then them sort of like cheering and rallying, like, yes, we were right. We got the right place. And that sort of built my trust in the narrative. And I was like, oh, I guess, this can be predicted and this is a fun place to go. And I think the next turn also happened in the first part of our reading, where, in fact, the entire project that we've sunk all of our hopes and politics into, that's also a scam. We're not actually here on the edge of the empire to build an encyclopedia. So I think those two things really pushed the narrative forward for me, because both of those happened before we hit, 100 pages. So for me, it moved in a very lively manner, where, my thoughts on the three body problem, I think you could pretty much skip the first 80 pages. So that was my opinion.
It gives me hope to know that it just gets better, because I was struggling a little bit with the political dialogue of this. But another observation that I had was the Encyclopedia Galactica excerpts immediately reminded me of the excerpts of Past Outside of Time that are interspersed through Death's End, and it almost made me wonder if like Liu Cixin was kind of emulating that particular style. It's not like a new style or anything, but like it just read very similarly to me, probably because I just recently read Death's End. Yeah.
Yeah, like the excerpts from the book that was written in the future, right, that are now contemporaneous, talking about like the events that are happening. Yeah, I would be very surprised if there wasn't at least in the back of his mind, sort of.
I think it's just
yeah.
it's a tool that works. Like I love reading the Dune series and finding like, oh, here's a Bene Gesserit journal, like happens to thematically resonate with the next part, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I mentioned this on some other episode too, but Watchmen also has similar stuff where at the end of every episode or every comic, they have the kind of more world building, contemporaneous like news articles or some kind of biography or that kind of thing. So, I think one of the things I was thinking about when I was reading this is like I see a lot of like what I think is like references, but actually this might have like pioneered them, right? I feel like this is written 60 or 70 years ago now, right? So like these might have this might have been the first actual like the first kind of implementation of that kind of structure. I don't know. I haven't read much sci-fi previous to this,
I feel like
so
we
I
need
don't know
our
if he.
readers to educate us because we're
Yeah.
in the dark.
Yeah, so I think we kind of alluded to this, they are talking a little bit. Let's actually get into this book a little bit. And I thought like just the sense of world immersion I thought was really great for this section. And like again, like when I was listening to an audiobook, I didn't really get it, but like as I was reading it, like even like the first couple of chapters were like Dornick is going through just traveling to Trantor and taking the taxi and going on the observation deck, like all that stuff was really good and really kind of helped build the world up, I thought.
Oh, me too. I thought that was so real. Like you're a little nervous in the taxi, and then the hotel concierge is a little bit snippy with you, and of course that resonates 1,000 years in the future. I thought it was really effective.
And all the people are kind of like not kind of rude, but they're just like everything's just taken for granted.
Like
Like, oh
standoffish or something. Yeah.
yeah, they're like these rubes coming from the sticks, right? Like just take the taxi. It's fine.
Right.
I don't know if I'm going to get into it later, but the one thing that I did not fully appreciate, I think, about the world immersion was the affected speech of Lord Dorwyn. It was interesting for a little while, but after a while, it's just like really hard to read and hard to like decipher like what he's trying to say, like converting all the W's to R's. It reminded me of the scene from Life of Brian with the Roman Emperor, if you guys have seen that.
I thought you were going to say The Princess Bride.
I feel like I've heard that exact same speech pattern at some point. I could hear it in my head, but like I can't quite recall like which character in what movie have I heard who talks like this. But I was also thinking about like how painstakingly difficult it must have been to write, because like that can't be easy.
No. Yeah, they didn't have like switch and replace for like W or to R to W, right? That time you had to like probably type
Oh
it
my
out or write
God,
it.
yeah, but it's not just it's not just like a simple swapping of the W's, the R's with W's. It's just
Yeah.
he has written everything phonetically, and it's just I when it slows me down in my reading, I'm like, ah.
Yeah.
I think that we've had like, I think it's called rhoticism, like that speech impediment with the R's to W's in media before. So it didn't really bother me. And especially when you hear it in a radio play, it's just like very easy. It's like, okay, this is how the character speaks. So it didn't stop me, but sometimes like if I try and do the reason I can't really read fantasy is because in the first like 30 pages, the author is splashing out like all these words that he's made up. And like of
Hmm.
course he's made up elvish and he's made up dwarvish and I need to like sound my way through them and it feels like it's not to any point, but since this is just English that's been altered, it wasn't so bad for me. But I'll be interested to see if that's like polarizing.
Hmm.
Talia, are you revealing in this moment that you are not a Lord of the Rings fan?
No
Because
comment.
we're treading into some dangerous waters here.
All right, cut the microphones.
Oh yeah, man, you're ruining season 12 of Rehydrate.
I was a very big Lord of the Rings nerd. I was reading the
Very
books at
adept,
11.
Priya. Maybe you can evangelize to me. We'll see.
I had, well, I mean, in your defense, I had no life when I was 11, and all I did was read Lord of the Rings and then watch the movies because they were coming out around the same time. So, but I may or may not have tried to learn Elvish. So
Hmm.
let's
Well, I
not
do
rehash
applaud
that
that.
again.
I do applaud any linguistic attempt taken to that extreme.
I mean, to come up with one's own language is like that's the OG linguistic genius. So I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, like the Lord of the Rings books, after I watched the movies, I hadn't read the books, but I went back and listened to the audiobooks too, and those are actually good. Those were very well done audiobooks, I think. I was able to follow the story because like I said, I hadn't read them, so
To be continued on the next
yeah,
podcast season, which will be Lord of the Rings.
yeah.
Teaser for next episode. All right, let's get to the spying. I guess that folds into the politics that pervade the empire.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how it just sort of take as read that everything is going to be spied on. They had the spy beams or whatever they're called,
Hmm.
and then the commission actually gets mad that they blocked the spying. They're like, take away his device, and like, what are you doing? Yeah, it's I think it's just another detail that shows sort of the invasive and the kind of bloated nature of the empire. How everyone just spied on now, and even like put on trial for talking bad about the empire. Like Selden could have been sentenced to death, presumably by saying, spreading his ideas that the empire could have been or will fall in however many in 300 years, right?
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting when it's just taken as common knowledge, like, oh yeah, Selden has all these doomsdaying papers, and the PhD is like, what? I've never read that. I've read all of his works, and they're like scoffing, like, well, of course they're not published. Like,
Yeah.
those are the ones that we spied on him to see.
Yeah, for sure. The late stage empire stuff, I think, is it's just more of that world building that shows that lends credence to his theory later on or his calculation that the empire is going to fall.
Right? It's not a theory; it's mathematical
Right.
perfection.
his psychohistoric thesis. I think there's a lot of those instances or just kind of ideas that the empire is kind of stagnating, and they kind of sprinkle it through the whole series or these whole two parts, right? And kind of seeds it in your mind that his prediction is probably going to be right, or his calculations are probably going to be right. I think I kind of try to list a couple of them here. So first, Trantor not being able to support itself with agriculture and not caring about it either, just like importing everything. And Acreon not having nuclear power and probably no one having it, or even it seems like the Empire had it, but then they can't figure out how to fix it. Like no one kept up with the knowledge. Lord Dorwin willing to just read accounts of archaeology instead of actually going himself and experiencing it. The Empire not being able to negotiate an effective treaty with Anacreon. The Empire not being able to fix nuclear reactions or reactors. And finally, his Harry Seldon's prediction itself.
Another one that came to mind for me just now was also the fact that it's revealed at one point in the conversation with Dorwin that they seem to have forgotten the origins of humanity, like where human beings originated, and it's a matter of like it's all about like they have guesses as to where human beings originated. So it seems like historical information, it has sort of like almost like fallen apart at a point. Like they don't remember beyond a certain moment in history.
Yeah, I wonder if there was some event where those records were lost or something, and that's either they don't know, or really it's just not caring about the past. Because there's people always say like, if you don't learn from the mistakes of the past, you're doomed to repeat them, right? So
Right.
maybe that's what he's trying to say here.
Yeah.
So the idea of history as a form of currency, I know they do mention sort of leadingly, like it's not the only way to pay a bribe. Like there's more than just money. There's obviously like a credit system, but I thought of history and truth and the predictions being a form of currency that, does circulate this empire.
The other thing that this reminds me of, and this predates Asimov, and this is like canon sci-fi that you will read first if you dabble at all in sci-fi, especially within academia, is The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, which kind of takes a time traveler into a future era where humanity has devolved into two different races. Seemingly, the idea or the hypothesis, I guess, behind why this has happened is that they reached a moment in time where there's basically like a lack of problems to solve. Like we as human beings are currently kind of at that point in time where there is no need for like survival of the fittest in a sense, for a lot of people in the developed world, because like if there's a problem, we have the technology to fix it, and that technology is available to most people who can afford it in developed countries. So the upper class individuals, or I guess maybe people who are from developed worlds, you can think they no longer kind of need to be resourceful. So over like thousands of years into the future, they just become very physically and mentally weak, while downtrodden classes have turned brutal and barbaric. There's a lot of talk I noticed in the conversations that happen between characters in this book of barbaric planets and the impending era of chaos that would follow the downfall, which reminded me of the fate of humanity as Wells explores it through the de-evolution of humanity. So I think a lot of these ideas are seeded through Asimov's work, which is really fascinating because I read The Time Machine like ages ago, but these ideas are still like imprinted into my mind. So I can't see like why that wouldn't have been a big influence on what's happening in this book so far.
Yeah, I haven't read that, but yeah, that's a good point.
That's the next thing on your reading list then, Dan.
Yeah, I have so many things on my reading list, but yeah, like the more and more things like I should have read by now. Like
this is a classic.
yeah.
There's another interesting parallel that I found to Remembrance of Earth's Past, which is the question posed to Selden by the Emperor of why he should care about what happens 300 years later when no one alive today will be alive for that future, which is an idea that Sishin explores in so many different, like, people break up into factions of thinking about the Tri-Solarian conflict. That was very interesting. I can see that, like, that question seems to be directly lifted out of this existential dilemma that's posed right at the beginning of this book, which is that if something's not going to happen for 300 years, why should we care about it now? And it's interesting that Selden / Asimov's answer to this is something called humanity. That's why we care. So I think that was a really nice framing of that question, and then actually giving an answer to it, which is like, well, we should care for the sake of humanity.
Yeah, I wonder if Sishin also thought about it as sort of another, like the same way here where people, because the way I interpret it here is that like they don't care what happens 300 years in the future because they're just lazy and stagnating, right? Like I didn't get that sense from Remembrance Earth's Past. More that they're just like selfish and not thinking about the future. Like I think the theme of that book is more like we are too focused in on ourselves and our race won't survive unless we think beyond just the earth, but we never do. Like it's just like a constant series of like just being short-sighted.
Yeah, but also it's interesting because in Remembrance of Earth's Past, ideas like escapism and anything that basically leads to a sense of like apathy towards
Yeah.
the, like, what's going to happen to all of humanity is almost seen as like, I think he depicts it at one point as a crime against humanity. So
Yeah.
so
He does.
it's kind of like he is echoing this idea that's presented in this book a little bit at various moments. So of
Yeah.
course,
Yeah.
since this is all very fresh in my mind, I couldn't help but draw these parallels.
Yeah. I think it's also a good catch there.
So if you're looking for an explicit moment in the text where they are considering this question, I found it on page 85 when they were discussing, can we risk the present for the sake of a nebulous future? And not only is that being risk averse, I also noticed a definite article, like the present is now and we can actually improve it or make it worse. But the future, it's a future. We don't even know if it's coming. And I think that infects a lot of the dialogue around what's worth it. It's like, will we live to see it? Will our descendants live to see it? Is this going to benefit an upper class or us? So that's where I found it on the discussion, I believe, between the mayor and the ambassador.
Well, I think the next big concept or next big theme that shows up in the book is the idea of free will. And it looks like you guys had a couple of notes around that. So I will let Priya talk about her idea first.
I feel like a lot of sci-fi and just literature in general is very fascinated with the idea of free will. This is a little bit beyond the question of whether or not we have free will, but more so about the ultimate importance of free will? Does it have the ability to impact anything? And I think personally for me, the idea of mathematical formulas, because I'm not a mathematical person, predicting human behavior with that degree of certainty is like, it's very captivating, but at the same time, very terrifying and repugnant in how it reveals that there's actually very little influence of individual free will on the grand scale or on outcomes for that are, big picture outcomes. There are a few other books that I would shout out that really explore the same ideas. Of course, Remembrance of Earth's Past Again. So I think Sishin also explores that idea of like how much does free will actually configure into a predictable pattern of human behavior that will ultimately lead to a certain outcome no matter what. And then there's another book that I always keep referencing, which I can't wait to meet someone who has read this book because it's such an underrated work of sci-fi, but it's brilliant, and it's called A Canticle for Leibowitz, and it explores a post-apocalyptic world in which humanity sort of presses the reset button and then goes back to a primitive medieval type of society, which actually the current stagnating society, the empire and all of that kind of reminds me of that too, because it's almost like when you start to devolve as a society, you kind of go back to these almost like primitive sort of roots in your politics and in your way of understanding science. And so in this book, they go back and they form a society that predates scientific advancement. Like they bury all their scientific books, they lock them away. No one's allowed to explore science because, of course, science led to the apocalypse. And it explores the question of whether we would be doomed to arrive at the same disastrous outcome if we could do it all over again. And without giving any more spoilers to that book, I think it's very much in line with the idea of like there being almost like a mathematical sort of formula that predicts human behavior.
Yeah, I remember us talking about that before, and I have acquired the ebook, but I have not read it yet. Well, so I will.
Yes.
Because I remember, you talking about it, how good it was, and how many parallels there were to these are Remembrance of Earth Past, and now it seems like this book too. So,
Can you repeat the name one more time?
A Canticle for Leibowitz by I think it's by Walter Miller is the author's name. Beware that it reads very differently from a lot of sci-fi, and sometimes it can lose you, but it's my type of writing, which is like poetic writing that's like infused with science fiction elements. So it was really like up my alley. It might not be up everyone's alley, but ultimately, like after you read the book, you feel like you're better for having read the book, if that makes sense.
That's quite an endorsement.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites. It's definitely one that I look to in thinking about bigger concepts.
yeah, I think the idea of just like free will around this series is it's pretty interesting. Like how it seems like the kind of broad strokes are kind of taken as like these are going to happen no matter like what individual things, but like individual things could maybe influence, but probably with a very low percentage. Like if Selden would have been killed as far as his trial, right? Like that probably would have screwed things up. But maybe not. Like maybe like the Empire still would have. I mean, I think no matter what happened to him, like the Empire still would have fallen. It's just like maybe the Foundation wouldn't have tried to build a second Foundation, I guess, or the second Empire. According to calculations.
Priya's comments made me remember, other works of fiction, not necessarily science fiction, but, grappling with this concept of free will, because it's sort of telling about humanity as a whole that you could refute something by saying, that's an affront to free will. That reveals that we care about that and we think that we're in control of that. So any series that has like a prophecy in it is going to necessarily interact with free will. I thought about His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, and without a spoiler, it's the prophecy about Lyra Belacqua, that she must take this particular course of action without knowing what she must do. And it's foretold that she will have this big grand betrayal. And what ends up happening is she ends up hearing this prophecy and thinking, oh, I need to act as if I haven't heard it and act as if I don't know this prophecy, but I truly do know. And so she thinks that she has full knowledge and thinks she's betrayed someone, and then walks blindly into the true betrayal. So she tried to outmaneuver her fate and ended up doing it the same way.
I haven't read his Dark Materials, and I so regret that because it was one of the recommended readings in one of my classes back in the olden times when I was in college, and I never read it, and I feel like I missed out on a big
It's
big
still out
thing.
there,
Yeah,
and the
it
author
is.
is
Yes,
still alive. I have a signed copy that he signed in 2019.
yes, that'll have to be added to my list to finally get to it. Like
Did that come out as a TV show or as a movie? I remember
movie.
hearing about it. A
Oh,
movie?
yeah, it did come out as a kind of toothless movie.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the
See that.
series takes on a lot of concepts, not just free will. This is such a tangent, but it takes on organized religion, and very specifically the Catholic Church.
Hmm.
And the church was not ecstatic about that. And I thought of another, an obvious one, but an oldie but a goodie when we talk about free will is Greek tragedies. So think Oedipus, think Achilles, think Cassandra. Free will in that umbrella of storytelling in that genre is in tension with fate. And in that tradition, fate really is like capital F. They believe it's unalterable. And, Oedipus tries to escape his and again walks right back into what was prophesied to happen. So I think it's interesting to see which side this series will come down on. Like, is it a story about free will? Is it a story about fate? Or, we're only in part one. Maybe we don't actually know which story it's going to tell yet.
Or maybe like it turns into be, something like the empire does fall and the second empire comes up because of the foundation, but they fall into the same trappings, something like that. I
And,
actually don't know.
and since we are in the realm of classic literature now, I can't help but plug my favorite OG work of classic literature that explores free will. If that's an idea that's fascinating to you guys, is Paradise Lost by John Milton, which I read several times in college and was obsessed with. Um, it's written in the form of epic poetry, and it kind of explores at times like original sin and the fall of Satan through Satan's perspective. And
Hmm.
it explores the ideas of free will behind Adam and Eve defying God's will, and what Satan's reasoning is for why he is in rebellion against God, and how God knows all of this, but he doesn't do anything to interfere with that free will. And then it also brings up the question of, then is it free will or not? Of course, it's beautifully written because it's written by John Milton, so it's beautifully written. That's all I can say. And I think everyone should read it.
Oh, Priya, now you definitely have to read his Dark Materials.
I know.
As a Milton reader, you'll get much more out of it. I mean, there's Milton quotes all over. Anyway,
Yes, that it was in that same class that this book was recommended. So yeah, that makes sense.
So I know Priya, you talked about the characters themselves being a little bit. There's no one to really hang on to.
Yeah, I'm hoping that these names are really, really stumping me more than I expected. What's his name?
Harden.
Harden.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that Harden becomes a character that we sort of become fascinated by, but sadly, up until this point, I haven't encountered a single character that really piqued my interest. I was hoping actually at the beginning that Gal Dornick would be that character, but he kind of just fell off the story in part
Yeah.
2.
Yeah,
So
because they jump 50 years in the future. So
right, yeah.
yeah.
But I was hoping that there would be like an old man Gal Dornick in that 50-year future, but there was not. So
Yeah.
I'm hoping they give us something. But it's funny because like I think that was a common complaint with a Remembrance of Earth's Past, where we were finding like the characters weren't very compelling, and then it wasn't until the second book that you kind of got Loji, who was like such a great character. So I'm willing to hold on. I'm going to hold off my judgment until I read further.
How about you, Talia? Did you find any of the characters compelling or want to hear more?
Again, I have also been advised to reserve judgment because I don't think this is a spoiler because, like Dan mentioned, we don't know what's going to happen. But we were told, or I was told, reserve judgment because anyone that you find tedious or is like saying a lot but not actually communicating anything is like representative of the stagnating empire. So I do get this sense that like the stuff is right around the corner. And other than that, I think Hardin is the easiest character to follow. So I latched onto him.
Yeah, he's seems the most competent, right? Like, as the other council members are kind of aloof and just like not caring about anything, and all of the representatives in Acreon or Dorwyn, they're just also aloof and just only care about power and keeping that power and not even caring about anything. So yeah, I think the Hardin has like the most easy to latch on personality.
Yeah, and I think he maybe I was wrong. Like maybe he is the character who's compelling because he's kind of like he doesn't really care to be diplomatic. He's just kind of, and which is weird because he's a mayor, he's a politician, so he should be diplomatic, but he kind of just asks the questions that come to his mind. And I think like the character of I'm really thankful to you, by the way, for putting a character list in the notes because I keep going back to it to like remember their names. Piren, his character's whole purpose seems to just express shock at what Hardin has just said or asked of someone. That's your clue that, oh, like he shouldn't be saying stuff like that, but he is. So I'm interested to see where he goes from there.
I think Hardin is the most, like you said, confident, the most self-assured. Like I think there's that scene in his office where he like flicks and it's like, look at the motto, look at the board, and he has like, this moment where all the other characters they know, yeah, this is Hardin's thing. He says violence is the last refuge of the incompetent. So he's very comfortable
Yeah.
in his own, outlook and his own morals. So it's easy to get comfortable.
Yeah, that was a great quote.
I just hope they don't drop him like they dropped like a bunch of other characters so far.
Okay, well, I guess what are the things that you're looking for, going forward in this series? Like, do you have any predictions of where it's going to go? Like, I'm gonna hold off because I know a little bit more because I know about this book, but I'm gonna, since you guys have only read up to this point, what do you guys hope that you
We
see?
have the experience of being on the main show where
Yeah.
you know everything and we're just guessing.
But like I said, I listened to it and kind of zoning out a lot of times, so I forgot all that stuff that happens. But I know the broad strokes of what happens in the first book.
Well, I don't know what's obvious as hell where we left off. So I don't really have very many guesses as to what it is because it is like what we've seen up to this point is very political in nature. So it seems like almost like it could go any way. I don't really have any guesses.
I'm so glad you brought that up. The obvious as hell. I thought that was so cheeky.
Yeah, it is very cheeky.
Yeah, I'm not sure that you're meant to know what that means. Like he gets it and he's like, "Oh, it's so obvious. Like what I need to do." But I don't think that as a reader, because we don't know enough information at this point to
That's the
know
moment on
what's
the TV
obvious.
show where one character brings everyone into a huddle and the camera pans
Right.
away.
Yeah, there's going to be it's a nice cliffhanger to end this episode on or this like, this reading section on. But I do feel by this point in the book, I do feel like I'm drawn in. So I feel like the next portion of the reading is going to be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, and just overall, this book is pretty short. Like this, when I broke up the reading list, like this particular book is only 3 episodes because it's like around 70 pages or so. So we're gonna find out, like the middle part of the book is where probably a lot of stuff happens, right? So yeah, we'll know pretty quickly. Unlike Remembrance for the Past, where we had 10 episodes or something to figure out, and kind of there was a little bit of wheel spinning at times. So I don't think there's gonna be a lot of wheel spinning in this series just because it's so short and compact.
Yeah, and one thing that I would say towards the end of this is that if people are finding themselves to be fans of Asimov and are enjoying this, I would strongly recommend reading I, Robot. It reads quite differently from this actually, but it's very endearing and it's quite different. I don't think I've seen the movie, the movie with Will Smith. Is that the one?
I think so. I haven't seen it either.
But the book is very different. I think the movie has just lifted certain ideas and elements from the book, but it's not the book at all. So don't, if you hated the movie, then don't let that be a deterrent to reading the book, because the book is something entirely different. And I love sci-fi that explores AI, so that's recommended reading in my opinion.
Yeah, and as far as my understanding, like that book or that series is like directly in the same timeline as this one. It just happened. It's like the first part of this timeline, because I think, as far as I understand, that happens kind of modern-ish day, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So like I think that when I looked at like the timeline of books, like that was like the first one, and then like the other robot series books happened, and then the Foundation books happened somewhere in the middle. I think there's some other ones after that.
Yeah, I think it's a really great intro to Asimov too, for someone who's just getting into Asimov, because it's very readable, very it's if I remember correctly, because I read this more than 10 years ago, it's written as a collection of short stories almost. It's a very fascinating read, and it's endearing, and it's very emotional, and yeah, you wouldn't expect certain things that you come across in that book, but you do, and it's lovely.
Well, if we turn into a fully Asimov podcast, maybe season 25 or whatever, we'll get to it.
Yeah, I think I feel like what's compelling us to talk about all these other works of sci-fi tangentially to what we're supposed to be talking about in this podcast is because I feel like Foundation sort of feels like a foundation for a lot of other sci-fi ideas that came after it. So
for sure.
So yeah, it's always like I can always find myself connecting the dots to other books that I've read that have these similar concepts and ideas.
Cool. Talia, do you have anything that you're looking forward to?
No, you guys pretty much took it all. I agree. Cosign.
Thank you very much for listening. Please check out rehydrate.space for release episodes, reading lists, pronunciation guides, and all the other information that we put up on there. Leave us comments by emailing us at rehydrate@fastmail.com or on Twitter at rehydratepod. Again, we're all newbies to this series, so any information that's not spoilery, send it our way, and we're happy to digest it and think about it in the context of our reading. And please join us next episode for Season 6, Episode 2, The Mayors and the Traitors, covering Part 3 and Part 4 of Foundation by Isaac Asimov.